Can you walk me home? A woman asked. The poor single dad didn't know she was a millionaire. A story that will change the way you see kindness forever. Before we begin this incredible journey together, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If this story touches you, if it makes you feel something real, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Every single like, every single subscription helps us bring more stories like this one to people who need to hear them. You never know, someone out there might be going through exactly what the characters in this story went through, and your simple click might be the reason they find hope today. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you into a story you will never, ever forget. The rain had not stopped for 3 days in the small town of Cedar Falls, Illinois. It was the kind of rain that made the whole world feel like it was grieving, the kind that turned the sky into a low gray ceiling and made every street look like a river of forgotten tears. The year was 2019, and in a tiny apartment above a laundromat on Baker Street, a man named Daniel Cooper sat at a kitchen table that wobbled on 3 good legs and one leg that had been replaced with a stack of old textbooks. He was staring at a pile of bills spread out in front of him like a losing hand of cards. Electric bill. Water bill. Past due rent notice, the 3rd one this month, this time printed on pink paper, which he had learned meant they were serious. And at the very bottom of the pile, the one that made his stomach clench like a fist every time he looked at it, was a medical bill for $4,762. It was for his daughter, Lily. Daniel was 31 years old, but the lines on his face belonged to a man of 50. His hands were rough and cracked, the hands of a man who had spent the last 6 years working every job that would have him: dishwasher, warehouse loader, night shift janitor, weekend lawn mower, and for the past 14 months, a cook at a small diner called Rosie's on the corner of Main and 5th. He made $11.25 an hour, and he worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when Rosie would let him pick up extra shifts. Every single penny went to keeping a roof over his daughter's head and food on their wobbly table. There was never anything left over. There was never anything extra. There was only survival, day after day, like walking on a tightrope over a canyon with no net below. Lily was 6 years old, and she was the entire universe compressed into a small body with wild brown curls and enormous green eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any child her age had a right to. She had been born with a congenital heart condition, a ventricular septal defect, the doctors called it. A hole in her heart. The irony was not lost on Daniel. His daughter had been born with a hole in her heart, and ever since her mother had left, he felt like he had been living with one too. Lily's mother, Jessica, had left when Lily was 7 months old. She had looked at Daniel one evening, the baby crying in the next room, the apartment smelling like formula and exhaustion, and she had said the words that still echoed in his skull at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. "I can't do this, Daniel. I'm not cut out for this. I'm sorry." She had packed one suitcase. She had not packed the diaper bag. She had not packed any of Lily's things. She had walked out the door and into a car that was waiting for her at the curb, driven by a man Daniel had never seen before, and she had never come back. No phone call. No letter. No child support. Nothing. She had simply evaporated from their lives like steam from a kettle, and Daniel had been left holding a screaming baby in a cold apartment, wondering how he was supposed to do this alone. But he had done it. Day by day, hour by hour, diaper by diaper, fever by fever, he had done it. He had taught himself to braid Lily's hair by watching YouTube videos at 2 in the morning. He had learned to make her favorite meal, macaroni and cheese with little pieces of hot dog cut into star shapes using a cookie cutter he had found at a thrift store for a quarter. He had read her the same bedtime story 473 times because it was the only book they owned, a tattered copy of Goodnight Moon, that he had found in a box of free books outside the public library. He had held her during every thunderstorm, whispered to her during every nightmare, carried her to the emergency room 3 times in the middle of the night when her lips turned blue and her breathing became shallow and his entire world narrowed to the sound of her tiny heartbeat, terrified that each beat might be the last. He would have given his life for her without a moment's hesitation. He would have given anything. The problem was that he had nothing to give except himself, and the world did not seem to care about that. On this particular rainy evening, Daniel had just finished his shift at Rosie's diner. It was almost 10 o'clock at night. He had picked Lily up from Mrs. Henderson's apartment 2 floors down. Mrs. Henderson was a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher who watched Lily in the evenings for free because she said it kept her young, though Daniel suspected she did it because she had seen the desperation in his eyes and had a heart too big for her small body. Lily was already asleep when he carried her up the stairs, her head on his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. He laid her gently in her bed, which was actually his bed, since there was only one, and he slept on the couch every night, and he pulled the blanket up to her chin and kissed her forehead. Then he sat down at the wobbling table and opened the mail, and the world fell out from under him again. The letter from the hospital was not just a bill this time. It was a notice informing him that Lily's upcoming cardiac evaluation and the potential surgery that Dr. Patel had been discussing with him for the past year would not be covered by his insurance. The estimated cost was between $75,000 and $120,000. Daniel read the number 3 times. Then he put his head in his hands and cried, silently, so he wouldn't wake Lily, his shoulders shaking like a bridge in an earthquake. $75,000. He made roughly $23,000 a year before taxes. He had $312 in his bank account. He had no family, his parents had died in a car accident when he was 19, and he had been an only child. He had no friends with money. He had nothing, absolutely nothing, except a little girl with a hole in her heart who needed him to figure this out. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He took a deep breath. He looked at the picture taped to the refrigerator, a crayon drawing Lily had made at kindergarten. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall and one short. Above them, in wobbly letters, she had written "Me and Daddy." She had spelled "Daddy" wrong, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I'll figure it out," he whispered to the empty room. "I always figure it out." But this time, he had no idea how. The next morning was a Saturday, Daniel's one day off, though he had been thinking about asking Rosie for extra weekend hours. He woke up on the couch with a crick in his neck and the sound of Lily singing in the kitchen. She was standing on a step stool, pouring cereal into a bowl, and approximately 40% of the cereal was making it into the bowl while the rest was scattered across the counter and floor like confetti at a very sad parade. "Morning, Daddy," she said brightly. She was wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with little rockets on them, and her hair was a magnificent brown explosion in every direction. "Morning, baby girl," he said, forcing a smile that he hoped reached his eyes. "Making breakfast?" "I made it for you too," she said proudly, pointing to a second bowl that contained approximately 3 Cheerios and what appeared to be a large quantity of imagination. "That looks perfect," he said, and he sat down and ate those 3 Cheerios like they were a feast prepared by a 5-star chef, because to him, they were. After breakfast, Daniel cleaned up the cereal and got Lily dressed. They had a routine on Saturdays. They would walk to the public library, where Lily could read books for free and Daniel could sit in a warm building without having to pay for heat. Then they would walk to the park if the weather was nice, and Lily would play while Daniel sat on a bench and tried to figure out how to make the math of his life add up to something that wasn't a negative number. But today, the weather was not nice. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky was still the color of an old bruise, and the air was cold enough to remind everyone that winter was coming whether they were ready for it or not. Daniel zipped Lily into her coat. It was a little too small for her now, the sleeves ending about 2 inches above her wrists, but it was the only coat she had, and he had been putting off buying a new one because coats cost money and money was something that existed in other people's lives. They walked to the library. Lily held his hand and chattered the entire way about a butterfly she had seen the previous week and how she had decided its name was Margaret and she was worried about where Margaret would go now that it was raining and did butterflies have umbrellas, Daddy? Daniel listened and answered every question with the patience of a saint, because these were the moments, these small, ordinary, impossibly beautiful moments, that made everything else bearable. At the library, Lily ran straight to the children's section and pulled out her favorite book, a picture book about a rabbit who goes on an adventure to find a golden carrot. She had checked it out so many times that the librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Torres, had eventually told Daniel that Lily could just keep it. Daniel had almost cried at that small act of generosity. He had thanked Mrs. Torres so many times that she had finally told him to stop thanking her or she would take the book back. While Lily sat cross-legged on a beanbag chair and read her book with the fierce concentration of a Supreme Court justice reviewing a brief, Daniel wandered to the adult section and sat down at one of the computer terminals. He opened a browser and searched for financial assistance for children's heart surgery. The results were overwhelming and discouraging at the same time. There were charitable organizations, but the wait lists were months or years long. There were crowdfunding options, but Daniel didn't know enough people to share a campaign, and the thought of putting his daughter's medical condition on the internet for strangers to judge made his skin crawl. There were government programs, but he had already applied for Medicaid 3 times and been denied because of a paperwork error that nobody seemed able to fix, and every time he called the office he was put on hold for 2 hours and then disconnected. He closed the browser and stared at the blank screen. His reflection stared back at him, a tired man with dark circles under his eyes and a 2-day beard and a flannel shirt with a small tear in the collar. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who was running out of options and running out of time. The day continued. The rain continued. The worry continued. But Daniel did what he always did, he put one foot in front of the other and kept going, because Lily needed him to keep going, and she was the only reason he needed. That evening, Daniel dropped Lily off at Mrs. Henderson's apartment. He had picked up a Sunday shift at the diner, but first, he needed to stop at the 24-hour pharmacy to get Lily's medication refilled. She took a small daily dose of a drug that helped regulate her heart rhythm, and they were down to the last 3 pills. The medication cost $67 a month with his insurance copay, and he had exactly $89 in cash in his wallet. He had been saving it for the electric bill, but Lily's medication came first. Lily's medication always came first. He walked to the pharmacy in the drizzle. Cedar Falls was not a big town, and most things were within walking distance, which was fortunate because Daniel did not own a car. He had sold his old Honda Civic 2 years ago to pay for one of Lily's emergency room visits. Since then, he walked everywhere, to work, to the grocery store, to the pharmacy, to Lily's school. In the summer, it wasn't so bad. In the winter, it was misery, but it was the kind of misery he had learned to absorb into his body like one more bruise that would never fully heal. The pharmacy was bright and warm and smelled like cleaning solution. Daniel went to the prescription counter and gave them Lily's name. The pharmacist, a young man with glasses and an apologetic expression, typed something into the computer and then frowned. "Mr. Cooper, it looks like there's been a change in your insurance. The copay for this medication has gone up." Daniel felt his stomach drop. Gone up to what? $112. The number hit him like a physical blow. $112. He had $89. He was $23 short. $23 between his daughter and the medication she needed to keep her heart beating properly. Is there a generic version?" he asked, and he hated the way his voice sounded, thin and desperate, like a man begging. "This is the generic version, sir." "I'm sorry." Daniel stood at the counter and stared at the white tile floor. $23. He could feel the pharmacist's discomfort, the way the young man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, wanting to help but constrained by the cold mathematics of a system that put profit margins above little girls with holes in their hearts. Could I get a partial refill?" Daniel asked. "However many pills $89 would cover?" The pharmacist checked. "I can give you a 23-day supply instead of 30. "I'll take it," Daniel said. He paid the $89, took the small white bag, and walked out of the pharmacy into the rain. He would figure out the rest. He would pick up an extra shift, or find a side job, or donate plasma. He had done that before, sitting in a chair with a needle in his arm while his blood was separated into its components, earning $35 per session to help keep his daughter alive. He would do whatever it took. He always did. It was nearly 9:30 now, and the streets of Cedar Falls were mostly empty. The rain had chased everyone indoors, and the streetlights cast wavering reflections on the wet pavement that looked like pools of melted gold. Daniel walked with his head down, the pharmacy bag tucked inside his jacket to keep it dry, his mind churning through numbers that never added up. He was passing the intersection of Main and Elm when he heard it, a voice, soft but clear, cutting through the sound of the rain like a bell through fog. "Excuse me?" Daniel stopped and looked up. Standing under the awning of a closed antique shop was a woman. She was maybe 28 or 29, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and large brown eyes that caught the light from the street lamp. She was wearing a long coat that looked expensive. Daniel didn't know much about women's fashion, but even he could tell that the fabric was something better than what you'd find at the thrift store, and she was holding a small leather purse against her chest. She looked out of place in Cedar Falls, like a character from a different movie who had wandered onto the wrong set. But what struck Daniel most was the look on her face. She looked scared. Not terrified, not in immediate danger, but afraid in the way that someone is afraid when they are alone in an unfamiliar place and the world feels too big and too dark and too wet. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, and her voice had a slight tremor in it. "I know this is going to sound strange, but, can you walk me home?" Daniel blinked. "Walk you home?" "Well, not home exactly. I'm staying at the Cedar Inn, about 6 blocks from here. I was supposed to call a car, but my phone died, and I don't." She paused and looked down the empty street. "I don't really know this area, and it's dark, and I know it's a lot to ask a complete stranger, but you seem—" "I seem what?" She met his eyes, and something passed between them, a recognition, maybe, of two people who were both alone in the rain, both carrying burdens that no one else could see. "Safe," she said simply. "You seem safe." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He was tired. He was wet. He was $23 short of his daughter's full medication supply. He had to be up at 5 in the morning for his shift. Every practical bone in his body told him to politely decline and keep walking. But then he thought about Lily. He thought about what he was teaching her by the way he lived his life. He thought about all the times someone had shown him a small kindness, Mrs. Henderson watching Lily for free, Mrs. Torres giving Lily the book, Rosie at the diner letting him take home leftover food at the end of his shift so Lily would have something to eat. The world had not been generous to Daniel Cooper, but the few moments of grace he had experienced had been enough to keep him believing that goodness was real, that it mattered, that it was worth passing on even when you had nothing left to give. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can walk you." And with that single word, that single, simple act of saying yes when he had every reason to say no, Daniel Cooper's life began to change in ways he could not possibly have imagined. They walked side by side through the rain. The woman had a small collapsible umbrella in her purse, and she opened it and held it between them. It wasn't big enough to cover both of them, but they each got partial coverage, and it was better than nothing. "I'm Elena," she said as they walked. "Elena Vasquez." "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Cooper. Thank you for doing this, Daniel. I know it's weird. I promise I'm not a serial killer or anything." He almost smiled. Almost. That's exactly what a serial killer would say. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised and genuine, and the sound of it was so unexpected and so warm that Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of tension that had been pulled tight for so long he had forgotten it was there. "Fair point," she said. "Okay, how about this? I'll tell you something true about myself so you know I'm a real person. I'm from Chicago. I'm here in Cedar Falls because I'm taking some time to figure things out. I checked into the Cedar Inn this afternoon, and then I went for a walk, and I walked too far and it got dark and my phone died, and suddenly I was a 30-year-old woman standing alone on a street corner in a town I don't know feeling like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," Daniel said. "Phones die. It happens." "You're kind," she said, and the way she said it, with a note of surprise, as if kindness were something she had read about but rarely encountered, made Daniel wonder about her story. Everyone had one. Everyone was carrying something. "So what about you?" she asked. "Do you live here in Cedar Falls?" "Born and raised," he said. "Well, born and still here, anyway." "Raised might be a strong word. What do you do?" "I'm a cook. At a diner called Rosie's. Nothing fancy. Burgers, eggs, pa."